Doctor Who Season by Season. Season 4 Review. Season 4 of Doctor Who ran from late 1966 to mid-1967 for a total of 43 episodes. It was the first season to star Patrick Troughton as the second Doctor, though you could forgive audiences of the time for not realizing that, as the season actually begins with William Hartnell still very much going strong as the first Doctor, with no initial on-screen indication of the momentous change that the central character and the program was about to undergo. The season begins with The Smugglers, a four-part historical adventure written by Brian Hales in which the Doctor and his new companions Ben and Polly, played by Michael Craze and Anna Quills, get involved with smugglers on the Cornish coast. Sadly, not one episode of this story remains in the archives and, yes, this is the point where I have to break the bad news. Season 4 is by far the worst affected season of Doctor Who in regards to the infamous archive purge, and there is, in fact, not one story in this season that is fully complete in its original form. This does inevitably make it very difficult to give anything even remotely resembling accurate reviews, which is why I haven't done this season before, but I will do my best. Based on the Hurricanes animation, The Smugglers seems like an average but generally okay story, if a fairly unremarkable season premiere. It's a bit dull, though undoubtedly the story would benefit if we could actually see the actors' actual performances, not to mention the apparently extensive location shooting, but there you go. The next story is The 10th Planet. The 10th Planet is a monumental story in the history of the program. Not only is it the very first story to feature the Cybermen, but even more importantly it is the story with the very first regeneration, as William Hartnell's Doctor collapses at the end of the tale and changes into Patrick Troughton. Which makes it something of a shame that, as a story, The 10th Planet is actually a bit of a dud, I'm afraid. The guest characters are 100% stock cardboard. Hartnell gives a good showing in episode 1 but then falls sick and is essentially redundant for the rest of the story, which is pretty shit as an exit for a man who is still one of the greatest Doctors ever. He does get a hair-raising scene in the last episode, Mind, as the addled and dying Doctor issues the "it's far from being all over" line, and Hartnell delivers it chillingly, like a ghost from the future. And the Cybermen are a bit shit too. Modern fandom has retconned the original Cybermen as being awesome to such a degree that they're even coming back in the new series, yet the reality is they were changed almost immediately because they suck. They look ridiculous, and ridiculously cheap, and they sound even worse. I'm afraid I find it very difficult to find an alien who sounds like Zippy from Rainbow in any way menacing. Yes, the body horror idea behind the original look is sound and creepy, but the actual execution is just painful to watch. The final episode, the most important one, is missing from the archives, though it has been officially animated for the DVD release and the actual footage of the regeneration itself does at least actually still exist. The next story is The Power of the Daleks, a 6-part story written by former script editor David Whittaker that marks the arrival of a new Doctor for the first time ever. Sadly, aside from a BBC One trailer and a couple of brief clips, all of this monumental story is currently missing from the archives. However, last year the story was animated in full for a DVD and subsequent Blu-ray release, to much hype. The story is widely regarded as one of the best ever, and I suspect the real thing might very well be, but I was a bit leery on the animation, to be honest. It's a bit weak, especially with the humans, and especially with the first couple of episodes, including the all-important regeneration scenes. It's clearly a well-written and well-acted story, but it's just not the same, and as it stands my favorite new Doctor stories still remain Spearhead from Space and The 11th Hour. The next story is The Highlanders, a 4-part adventure that is not only the last pure historical story in the series until the 1982 Peter Davison 2-parter Black Orchid, and the last time the subgenre appears as a regular part of the series format, but which also introduces Jamie McCrimmon, a Scottish Highlander played by future Emmerdale Farm actor Fraser Hines, who would become one of the most popular and longest-serving companions in the history of the program. Indeed, Jamie is almost impossible to disassociate from the Second Doctor and his era, and remains until the very last Troughton story, The War Games. Sadly, this is another story that is completely fucking missing from the BBC archives. My opinion of it is basically the same as the Smugglers. It's passable if unremarkable, and would be a whole lot better if we could actually watch the real thing. Thanks for fucking nothing, BBC. The next story is The Underwater Menace, a 4-part story written by Jeffrey Orme, in which the new-look TARDIS crew find themselves in modern Atlantis and come up against a mad scientist who's planning to drown the whole world just for the sheer fucking hell of it. For a long time all that existed of this story was Part 3, which is gloriously, uproariously over the top, with Joseph first competing with Graham Crowden in Horns of Nimon for the most outrageously camp villain performance in the entire series. It's absolutely fucking hilarious, with first getting more and more manic as he does a run-up to the closing Nothing's Vault Can Stop Me Now cliffhanger that has passed into legend. I so wanted to see the rest of this story, as I thought it might be a 60s Nimon in full, a very good thing in my opinion. Remarkably, Episode 2 actually turned up in 2011, and while everyone else in fandom seemed to think it was better than Part 3, I was rather disappointed by it and didn't think it was anywhere near as fun. That missing episode was finally released on DVD a year or so back, albeit grudgingly by a slack bastard extraordinaire BBC who not only didn't animate the 2 missing episodes but put out a rekin of them instead that was of such unbelievably shite quality and unwatchability that not only is it still hard to judge the story as a whole, as who in hell could sit through that shit, but is impossible to regard as anything other than the BBC actively taking the piss. The next story is The Moon Base, a 4-part story that sees the return of the Cybermen in speedy fashion, thankfully redesigned. I like these Cybs and indeed the rest of the 60s variants a whole lot more than any other except the excellent David Banks' 80s iterations. 2 episodes of this story are missing but were officially animated for the DVD release, and that's no bad thing, as The Moon Base is a pretty good story with a nicely creepy atmosphere and is probably my favorite of the season, at least in the sense of being one of the few that we can actually watch all of it in one form or another. Again, it would be better if we had the whole thing in live action, but at least we can see what the actors and sets etc. actually look like here. The next story is The Macra Terror by Ian Stewart Black, a 4-part story about giant crabs and brainwashing in a rather too cheery colony that is yet another story from this fucking season that is completely bloody missing. Is it any good? Who the fuck can tell? Well, the writers' 2 previous stories, The Savages and The War Machines from Season 3, are both pretty solid stuff, so there's no reason to think this isn't, but beyond that God only knows. The next story is The Faceless Ones, a 6-part story that sees the departure of Ben and Polly from the series. Jamie had pretty much made Ben redundant as male companion from the moment he stepped on the TARDIS, but it's a shame Polly had to go too, as she's hot as fuck and far too much of her stuff is fucking lost. Only episodes 1 and 3 remain of this story, but these episodes are absolutely fantastic and indicate that this story could well be something of a forgotten and underrated classic. The production values are great, the direction is top-notch, atmospheric and menacing, the story is very interesting and the guest cast rocks hard too, including Pauline Collins of all people, Bernard Kay as a Scottish cop and Donald Pickering, who is as icy as fuck as the menacing Captain Blade. The Faceless Ones is one of the stories I would most like to see properly in full. Watcher fucking playing at Phil Morris? The final story of the season is Evil of the Daleks, a mammoth 7-part story from David Whittaker that cuts an epic sweep from modern London to Victorian times to the Dalek homeworld of Skaro in what was intended to be their very final appearance in the programme, and also introduces the new companion in the form of Victoria Waterfield, played by Deborah Watling. Sadly, yes, you can probably guess what I'm going to fucking say here, almost all of this story is missing. Only episode 2 remains, and as with Faceless ones, it's as frustrating as fuck because this episode is absolutely top shelf quality stuff and indicates that evil is also bloody fantastic, and we can only dream and fantasize that the rest of the story is as good and will one day be returned to us from the heavens, or some shelf in Nigeria or something. As I have already noted, it is pretty difficult to review Season 4 and even more difficult to come up with a rating for it. Much of it looks like extremely solid stuff, but with so much missing, eulogizing it too much strikes me as an incredibly dangerous and rather disingenuous endeavor. I suspect the real rating for the whole of the real thing would be even higher, but with so much missing, the highest I can give Season 4 is a B+.